Welcome to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. My name is Landon Blake. I am your podcast host. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the podcast. If you're curious and you'd like to learn more, we have a special page for the podcast up at www.landonblake.com. Make sure you check that out. We've got our show notes there. You can also download the podcast in your favorite audio format. You should also be able to find the podcast on Spotify and on YouTube. So we've got the podcast episodes in both of those places. So if you use one of those apps or services, you can subscribe to the podcast there. Full disclaimer, I record most of these episodes at my home in Stockton, California. I am married to a crazy Mexican woman, and I have 2 dogs, so you may hear her or the dogs during the podcast episode. I just want to warn you ahead of time. I love all 3 of them, but they are noisy. So if you would like to sponsor a private recording studio for the podcast, make sure you reach out to me and let me know that. Otherwise, you may have some background noise. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we're going to jump right into today's episode. The title of today's episode is An Introduction to Strategic Planning for Your Survey Organization. Before we get into the deep dive on this episode, I wanted to share a couple resources. So if you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. I'm going to share my screen with you. There's 3 articles that I read for this to prepare for this episode. The first one I have read several times, and I need to read it several more times. It is one of the best business articles I have ever read in my life. And the title of it is What is Strategy by Michael Porter. It's on Harvard Business Review. If you go there, you should be able to read that article at no charge. I can't overstate how excellent it is. It fundamentally changed the way I think about business and think about business strategy. So definitely, if you don't do anything else as a result of listening to this episode, go find that article and read it. We'll get a link in the show notes. There's an article on Medium by a gentleman. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Mank. Kira. It's called Strategy and Tactics. It's a kind of compares strategy and tactics. It's a good article. I think it's worth a read if you're thinking about this. And then the third article is also about the difference between strategy and tactics. It's the title is Strategy versus Tactics. What's the difference and why does it matter? That's by Kaylin Rogers. Again, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. That article is up on Forbes. We'll get a link to it. So all those were excellent articles, so I encourage you to read those. So I wanted to share those resources right here at the beginning of the podcast. So, but why is this important? Why are we talking about strategy today? The main reason I think this is important is the ultimate success of your surveying or mapping organization is basically supported on or built on 3 pillars. Okay, so what are the 3 pillars? The 3 pillars are strategy, execution, and people. So, in a nutshell, those are the 3 things that are going to make your business successful or unsuccessful. And you need all 3. So you have to have strategy, a good strategy, the ability to execute that strategy, and you need good people to do that. If you're missing any one of those pillars, one of those 3 pillars, is going to be really hard to be successful as a business. Now, you can do that, I think, but you're going to be successful despite the lack of those things, not because of it, those 3 pillars. So strategy is one of the 3 pillars. So if you don't have a good strategy, what I call positioning strategy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, you won't know what to execute, how to execute it, or who should execute it. So having a good strategy is key to the other 2 pillars, right? Execution and people. So I think if you want to run a successful surveying and mapping organization, getting your strategy figured out is really critical. It's one of the first things that you should do. So super important to your success as an organization. Now, before you start figuring out your strategy, there are some other things that I think you need to do. So before you sit down, for example, to create a strategic plan, which we're going to talk about in a future episode, there's some other things that you should do. And I call these things the foundational 5. Okay, so these are 5 things you should have figured out, or that you should have some level of understanding about before you go to define your strategy. So what are those 5 things? They are the purpose of your organization, the mission of your organization, the vision of your organization's core values, and your organization's operating principles. Those things are really important. So they're not the same. So people oftentimes confuse the first 3, purpose, mission, and vision. I need to do a separate episode where I talk a little bit about why those 3 things are not the same. Now, I will tell you, you don't have to have every detail of all 5 of those things, hammered out. I think you need to be adaptable. Those things will change potentially as your business grows and as you learn as a business leader or an organization leader. But I think you should have some idea before you sit down to do a strategic plan. You should have some idea of what those 5 things are: your purpose, your mission, your vision, your core values, and your operating principles. And one of the things I did very early on with our Surveying Business Redefined Horizons is I sat down and I thought a lot about those 5 things, and I wrote them down. And so we have them. We call them the business constitution. So if you come to work here, that's one of the things you get on your very first day. In addition to your team manual, you get a copy of the business constitution. Now, we could do a better job of making sure all of our team members understand those 5 things. And so that's something that I'm working on. But certainly the 3 principles know what those things are. And we try and, when we're making decisions, we try and take those 5 things into consideration, those 5 parts of our business constitution. So you do have to think a little bit about what your organization is and what it stands for and how it operates, I think, before you sit down to hammer out your strategy. Now, people, when they talk about strategy in business, they talk about different things. So they mean different things. So I had to come up with a way to clarify the 2 different types of strategy that we're going to talk about in this episode. So the first type of strategy that we're going to talk about is what I call positioning strategy. Okay, and I'll define that in a minute. The other type of strategy that I'm going to talk a little bit about in this episode is execution strategy. Okay, so positioning strategy, the short version is how do you position yourself in the market? Execution strategy is how do you take down your big picture goals? All right, so let's talk about positioning strategy for a little bit. We're gonna start with that. So we're going to talk about positioning strategy. Then we're going to talk about what is the difference between execution strategy and tactics. Then we're going to talk about an example of execution strategy, and it's actually an example that came from one of those articles I mentioned, one of the 3 articles I mentioned in the beginning. But we'll talk about an example of execution strategy and try and illustrate the difference between execution strategy and tactics. Now, I will tell you, before we jump in on positioning strategy, so the first of the 3 articles that I showed you there, What is Strategy by Michael Porter, that article is about positioning strategy. The other 2 articles on the differences between strategy and tactics, those are about execution strategy. So when you read those articles, that information might help you put those articles in the appropriate context. So what is what I call positioning strategy? What does that mean? So organizations, could be a business, could be a nonprofit, could be a government agency. All organizations provide value through some bundle of related activities. Right? So if you think about a surveying company, that would include things like research, field surveying, data processing and adjustment, mapping. Right? So that is a bundle of related activities. It's how we provide value to our clients. One of the examples they use in the article by Michael Porter, he uses the example of an airline. So an airline does things like, they sell tickets, they check baggage, they have to fuel and maintain airplanes, they have to train pilots. They have to, lease terminals or gates at airports. So that's a bundle of activities that an airline business uses to provide value to its clients. So that bundle of related activities determines what type of value you're going to provide and also determines the organization's cost structure, right? So as you change the bundle of activities, you change the cost structure and you change the kind of value that's provided. That's one of the key insights of that article by Michael Porter. And the type of value and the amount of value you provide is going to determine how much you can charge, right? What price the business can charge. And when you take the price you can charge and subtract your cost, the cost structure, what's left over is your profit, typically, right? So this positioning strategy, or this selection of the bundle of activities that an organization is going to perform is really key, right? It's going to determine your cost structure and the price you can charge, and as a result, that's going to dictate your profit, right? Do you have high profit margin, low profit margin, or no profit margin? Negative profit margin. So I need to do a separate video maybe that drills into that a little bit. So I'll try and remember to do that. So effective positioning strategy, in other words, a good positioning strategy, always involves making trade-offs. And I think that's the second key insight of that article by Michael Porter. And what he basically tells you in the article is you can't be good at everything, right? Or you can't serve all customer types over the long haul. You might be able to do that for a short time period, but eventually those trade-offs are gonna come and bite you. And let me give you a survey example, and then I'll mention one of the examples from the article by Michael Porter. So if you're going to be the type of survey company that works on large infrastructure projects, which we do here at Redefine Horizons, you are going to have a hard time competing in the lot survey business, at least in our part of California. Why is that? Well, the cost structure that you have to support to have the capabilities you need to work on a big infrastructure project, that cost structure, you can't support that cost structure doing lot surveys, right? Lot surveys are done, by one-man shops working out of their garage that don't have professional liability insurance a lot of times. So it's a very price-sensitive market. Most of the folks that play in that market have very low cost structure. I can't serve my larger infrastructure clients with that kind of cost structure, right? So there's a trade-off there. So one of the examples in the article that he gives, Michael Porter, he goes back, talks a little bit about airlines and says, Southwest decided to serve kind of non-traditional, non-business customers. And the way they made that model work is they flew the same airplane. So they only flew one type of airplane, which reduced their costs. They made direct flights that avoided major airline hubs, so that allowed them to get cheaper gate or terminal leases. And they charged they weren't selling luxury, right? They were trying to provide value to the bottom end of the market, and they did a really good job of that, right? And in the article, he mentions, when larger airlines tried to compete with Southwest, they got, Southwest ate them for breakfast because they didn't have the cost structure to support the kind of value that Southwest was delivering. So it's a really insightful example, and he has at least one or two others in the article, so I encourage you absolutely to read it. So the next part that I wanted to talk about, the next part of the episode, was the difference between execution strategy and tactics. So before we dive into that, let's just briefly talk about how is execution strategy different from positioning strategy. So positioning strategy, as I mentioned, is your process as a business leader of selecting the bundle of activities that your team is going to execute. Execution strategy is what's the best way to execute on that bundle of services, right? Those big picture activities. So what's the difference then between execution strategy and tactics? Okay, well, execution strategy is basically one of two things. It's either selection of big picture or long-term goals, or it's selection of an overall approach or a general path towards reaching those goals. Okay, so I want you to think about execution strategy as more big picture, right? And it's selecting a general approach or path towards a large and important goal. Okay, so it's not low-level concrete. That's tactics. Okay, so execution strategy looks wide, and occasionally it looks deep or it looks underneath, right? So execution strategy, when you're figuring out execution strategy, ask why. You ask why questions. You're trying to figure out what are the undercurrents, right? That's thinking deep. And you also look wide, right? So you're asking yourself, what's the context? What are the related issues, the factors of the problem? What's the overall environment that we're executing in? Okay, so execution strategy looks wide. It tries to look deep or look underneath, right? And ask those really important questions. So let me give you an example. Let's say you work for a civil engineering firm, and you can't find subconsultants. So you have a hard time attracting survey subconsultants, or maybe utility mapping subconsultants, or geotechnical engineers. Maybe you have a hard time. You can't get people to work for you. Okay, so execution strategy is looking at the bigger picture, right? Who is in the available pool of subconsultants? Why are they there? Why aren't there more of those subconsultants? What kind of customers are those subconsultants serving? What is their competitive environment like? That's kind of the big picture, the wide look. The deeper look is why. Why do subconsultants choose to work with our company? Why do they not? What do we do? Why do they get irritated or unhappy with us? So that's the deep dive, right? So now you can imagine if you're a civil engineer or a manager at that large civil engineering company, and they come to you and they say, all right, we can't find survey subs, you got to go fix that problem. If you just start to execute on tactics, you just pick up the phone and start calling every survey sub within 2 hours without thinking about that bigger execution strategy, right? The context and the undercurrents, you could waste a lot of time, right? If your company consistently pays subconsultant bills late, it may not matter how many phone calls you make. If you don't fix that root cause problem, your execution is going to continue to struggle. Right? So that's why execution strategy is really important. So remember, execution strategy, it's looking wide, right? Trying to consider the context, and it's looking underneath, digging deep, trying to find the undercurrents, right? That's the why questions. So what are tactics or tactical execution? Okay, a tactic is a specific and concrete action that you take to reach a high-level goal. Okay, so tactics operate over a short time frame or are frequently repeated. So as an example, right, I mentioned you reach out to a subconsultant you've worked with in the past. Like say in the last 3 years, you put together a list. Let's say you've worked with 12 subconsultants the last 3 years as a civil engineering company. You reach out to those subs and you ask, how can we improve as a client? That's a tactic, right? It's a specific action over a concrete period of time. It should have a tangible result. Okay, so I will tell you that one of the challenges with understanding the difference between tactics and strategy when you go and you research that and read the articles is I don't think there's a black and white line. Okay, where execution strategy stops and tactics start. I think it's more like a continuum. Okay, so it helps me to think about the opposite ends of that continuum, right? Strategy is asking why, looking at the context, choosing a general approach, right? Tactics are specific and concrete. Okay, so a good execution strategy, right, defines the goal, but allows you to switch tactics or to pivot when needed based on the facts on the ground and the results, right? So that's another thing that helps me understand the difference between tactics and strategy, right? Your big picture goals, your long-term goals that you would select either as part of a positioning strategy or an execution strategy, those are going to change much less frequently than your tactics. Right? You might regularly reevaluate and change tactics, right? But your big picture goals should probably change less frequently. So that's also a good way to determine, am I dealing with execution strategy or positioning strategy, or am I dealing with a tactic, right? So again, just to review, it can be complicated. Tactics, short time frame, tangible actions, right? Concrete actions, tangible results. You can change tactics if you need to without major repercussions. Right? Strategy, more big picture. asking why. It doesn't change very often. So they have an example in one of the articles I mentioned, and I want to just build on that. And it has to do with mountain climbing. So we're going to talk about, and I think this is a good example because it's going to allow us to talk about positioning strategy, execution strategy, and tactics. Okay, so let's just say I'm trying to, I'm 45, I'm going through a midlife crisis, and I want to think a little bit about, how do I position myself? What's my positioning strategy, my execution strategy, and my tactics? I want to become a world-class athlete, right? I want to be a world-class athlete before I get to age 50. Okay, now I'm just using this as an example. I'm not going to become a world-class athlete, but it's something I could see myself doing if I was not married, okay, at 45. So let's deal with positioning strategy first. So I say, all right, I want to become a world-class athlete before I'm 50 years old. Right? So let's think about that from a positioning strategy perspective. Okay? If you think about that goal, become a world-class athlete, that is probably way too broad. Right? It's way too broad. So I'm gonna struggle to translate that big picture goal into execution strategy or tactics because it's too broad. There's way too much competition out there, right? To be a world-class athlete. And I'm 45. So they're now, at 45, probably going to be hard for me to be a triathlete or a world-class athlete in a bunch of different areas, right? So that's probably too broad for me, and that's a mistake I see companies make. You got to remember, strategy is about trade-offs, right? So if your big picture positioning strategy is so broad that there's no trade-offs, it's not a good strategy, right? You need to narrow it. The second reason that's probably not a good idea, not a good positioning strategy to become a world-class athlete by the time I'm 50 is I don't have enough time. And I'm running a small business. I'm married. I take care of a foster son. I got a lot of things going on. I probably don't have enough time to be a world-class athlete. It's too broad, right? If I was 24 and somebody was paying me to be a world-class athlete, then that might be an achievable goal. Probably can't do it as when I'm 45 and a small business owner. So what that means is I need a more effective way to communicate to the world that I'm not a cream puff, right? I'm trying to convince people that I can be some type of world-class athlete. Even though I'm 50, I'm not a cream puff. There's got to be a better way to do that. So let's try and narrow that positioning strategy a little bit. So let's say, all right, I probably can't be a great tennis player or baseball player or basketball player. I just know that from some experience. One of the reasons I'm a land surveyor is because I don't have a lot of great physical coordination or grace. But I like spending time outdoors, and I enjoy hiking and backpacking. I think I could be a world-class mountain climber. Okay, so now, a little better positioning strategy, right? Not as broad, right? So I've narrowed that down a little bit, but as I think about that and I think about my personal circumstances, I realize, that's probably still too broad. Probably still too much competition in the world, right? Like, don't think there's any way I could ever afford to climb Mount Everest. And even if I could, I don't think my wife would let me, right? So probably can't be a world-class mountain climber. Can I narrow that some more? Can we make some more trade-offs? All right, well, what if I wanted to be best-in-class mountain climber in the continental United States? All right, a little more realistic, right? I'm dealing with a smaller set of mountains now. Probably a little more in my travel budget. Think maybe I could do that, right? A little more reasonable, less competition, right? But when I think about how achievable that goal is in my circumstances, I think, I probably need to narrow that some more. So I need a more narrow positioning strategy. So what if I decided that I would become not best in class, but a familiar and experienced California mountain climber? All right, now I think we're now that might be something I could achieve the next 5 years, right? I live in California. I can get to most of those peaks. I'm talking about becoming familiar, right? So I want people to be able to find out who I am and what I do. I just want to be experienced, right? I'm not trying to be the best or in the top 5, just somebody that has some experience. That I think might be achievable, right? So I've narrowed that goal down. Now I've made some trade-offs there, right? I'm not going to be world class, not going to be the best. I'm not going to travel the world, right? There's a lot of mountains I'm not going to climb, right? But I've also made it more realistic and achievable, right? And I think, when I think about who's the audience I could reach potentially, it's other people that live in California that might want to climb some of the peaks that we have in California. They might be interested in that journey that I would make. Okay, so I think I can dial it down even a little more. So now this might be too narrow, I'm not sure, but let me just throw it out there for you to think about. What if I said my positioning strategy is going to be to share my journey to climb the 5 tallest volcanic peaks in California, and I'm going to share all that online. All right, now that is a strategy I think I could execute on. Okay, why? Well, I'm good at sharing content online, right? I know how to do audio and video media. I've narrowed the class of peaks I'm going to climb. They're going to be volcanic. That means I don't have to climb Mount Whitney. Might be a little bit scary, right? Everything's in California. It's a pretty unique niche. I think that would work. I think I could execute on that given my circumstances. All right, now let's talk about. Now, like I said, it could be too narrow, but we're going to roll with it. And so, all right, now we've got our positioning strategy nailed down. What would our execution strategy and our tactics look like? What would that look like for me if I was going to execute this goal, right? And either personally or maybe I was going to put together a small team to do this. And you remember I told you execution strategy and tactics are on a continuum, right? There's not a black and white line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a list of activities, okay, that go from broader, so more on the execution strategy side of the spectrum, broad, big picture, to more concrete, right, and time-limited, tactical. Okay, so if my positioning strategy was to share my journey to climb the 5 tallest volcanic peaks in California online, what might my execution strategy and tactics look like? Starting with the broadest and going to the narrowest. So I might say, all right, I want to climb Mount Shasta in the summer of 2024. Right? That's a pretty big goal, right? Pretty big picture. Mount Shasta, volcanic peak in Northern California. Okay, now we could make that a little bit more focused. We could say, all right, I did some research. Now I know I'm going to climb Mount Shasta using the Cassable Ridge route. So there's multiple routes you can pick. I think that's the route I'm going to use, right? Still kind of big picture, right? But a little closer to tactic, right? Because I could change the route I used to climb the peak if I needed to, right? So it's a little closer to tactic. Now, the next thing I say, well, I'm going to read some guides on climbing Mount Shasta. Right? I'm going to buy some books or find some guides online. I'm going to read those. All right, that's a little more concrete, right? I could say I'm going to read at least 3 guides on climbing Mount Shasta by May 1st, 2024. All right, that's a tactic, right? Specific, concrete, time-limited, tangible results. I can measure my progress. I might say I'm going to study the topographic maps of Mount Shasta, right, by May 1st and identify key geographic features. Okay, again, more like a tactic. I might say, all right, I'm going to interview a person who has previously climbed Mount Shasta for my social media. Okay, so that's a tactic, right? Now you can make that more concrete, right? You can pick a person, schedule a date for the interview, right? Schedule a deadline for your interview questions, right? I could reserve my climbing permit for Mount Shasta. Okay, that's a tactic, right? Concrete. So I'd say by May 1st, I want to have my climbing permit. I might say by June 1st, I want to make my hotel reservation. And then by June 1st, I want to test all of my recording gear, my audio and video recording gear in a high-altitude outdoor location in the Sierra Nevada, which is close to my home. So I want to get out and test some of that equipment before I make the actual trip, right? Concrete, tactical. Okay, so you can see execution strategy, broad, right? I want to climb Mount Shasta, right? To narrow, I'm going to go test my recording gear in a high-altitude location, outdoor location before June 1st. So it was a good example in one of the articles. I wanted to build on it a little bit. I'll try and remember. We'll do a video and maybe we'll consider an example that's a little more business or survey oriented. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Just to review, what did we talk about? We talked about 3 articles on strategy that you might be interested in reading. We talked about what I call positional strategy, right? That's selecting the bundle of services that you're going to offer to your clients or your customers and understanding the trade-offs that are involved in that, right? We talked about that bundle of services drives your cost structure, the price you can charge, and ultimately your profit. Then we talked about what is execution strategy, how's that different from positioning strategy, and then how is execution strategy different from tactics, right? Remember, execution strategy looks wide, digs deep, right? Helps you figure out the general path or approach to big picture goals. Tactics, concrete, generally over a short time frame, produces some tangible results. I appreciate you guys listening to the episode. The next episode, we are going to talk about when you should hire your first employee as a small surveying business, right? It's a big decision. It's important. So I've got that episode is already outlined and scripted. We'll do that next. But I will let you know that after that, so I believe this will be episode 9, I want to return to this topic of strategy because I think it's really important. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can create a strategic plan document and a tactical plan document for a survey organization. And we'll actually walk through that. We'll walk through an example. So appreciate you guys tuning in to this episode, and make sure you catch the episode number 9 where we follow up on this idea of strategy and execution and talk a little bit about how you put together a strategic plan. That's going to wrap up our episode for today. Once again, I want to thank you guys for listening. Appreciate that. Don't forget, you can check out the podcast, download episodes, view show notes at www.landonblake.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast or you have a suggestion for a future topic for an episode, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find my contact information all over the web. Landon Blake, I'd love to hear from you, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.